Hello, everyone, and sorry for the slight delay to the start of our webinar. I'm Leah Thoms from the marketing team, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today, all about the recently passed ballot on 47-day TLS. I have Tim Callan and Nick France here for you today. And as always, this presentation is being recorded and we'll share it with you afterwards, most likely tomorrow. Finally, if you've got any questions during the presentation, send them our way. Please use the chat function and we'll answer as many as we can at the end. And with that, Nick and Tim, let's get started.
Thanks very much, Leah, and good afternoon, everybody. Tim is just having a small technical issue. He will be joining us in a minute or two, so you'll have me just to start with until he joins us. I'll begin by running through the agenda very briefly of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to cover all the details of this reduction in certificate lifetime, of course. We're going to start with a bit of a background on where this has come from, how we've ended up at 47 days and what the kind of general rationale is for where we're trying to end up here. We're going to go over a bit of the current status, what the timeline is, what the proposals are, and some of the expectations you can have to prepare yourselves and your business for this change over the next few years. We'll cover the steps you need to know to make sure you're going to be ready. Obviously, we'll talk about automation. Anybody that's listened to Tim and I talk before on these webinars or many other places, we talk a lot about automation. And then we'll briefly mention, of course, at the end, our favorite topic of post-quantum and post-quantum cryptography, how it relates to certificates and how it relates to this reduction down to 47 days. Do we have you with us, Tim?
Yeah, sorry about that. I had the very briefest of power outages, just long enough to knock off the internet modem. So I'm back.
Excellent.
Oh,
Good to have you
yeah.
with us, Tim. So I've just run through the agenda, and I think we're
Thank
going
you.
to start at the top of the slide of why 47 days.
Yeah. So go ahead, next slide, please. Leah, thank you. So yeah, for those of you who have joined us before, you know that all of this started a couple years ago when Google threw down the gauntlet and basically said to the community, we want to see certificate lifespan get down to 90 days. And there was a lot of discussion and action that kind of came out of that in various forms, which resulted last year in a concrete proposal. And this came from Apple. And what the proposal does is it steps us down in maximum term over time, or now I should say the past ballot steps us down in maximum term over time. We will get into the details of that ballot. However, on April 11, 2025, that ballot did pass, so it is no longer a proposal. It is now a passed ballot, and very shortly, barring any real strange outcomes, it will be official CA browser forum policy. The reason for 47 days in particular, we will get into. Um, but just let me make a point off to the right here, which is one of the biggest takeaway out of this is if we are not automating, we really need to be automating. And Nick and I will talk about automation over and over again in the course of this webinar, because one of the things you need to walk away with is you need to be making your plans for being automated, because at the end of the day, you're going to wind up on a monthly cadence, and doing things monthly rather than annually just increases your workload and your risk by a factor of 12. We all know how math works, and that's a lot. So next slide, please. Shorter, but before we get into that, shorter certificate lifespans. Why? So what were the drivers? And we'll get into the specifics of the step down periods and the times and why the numbers are what they are, because there's rationale behind all of that. At a higher level, what's the driver for shortening certificate lifespans to begin with? And at a highest level, just plain, they are more secure. So there are a number of things, just like any part of a computing ecosystem, there are a number of ways that a certificate or a key pair could be compromised. In theory, they could be misissued. Somebody in theory could fool a CA or own a CA or otherwise get certs that way. In addition to that, there are problems like loss of private key. this could happen through your own carelessness or through a malicious employee or through, a bad guy who penetrates and owns your systems. And all of these things, the faster your keys rotate and the shorter your certificates are, the smaller the attack window is. And this is the reason that the period as it is has gone just in the era of the CA browser forum from 5 years down to now 1 year and on its way shorter is because shorter certificate lifespans are fundamentally more secure. And the more we can shrink that attack window, the more secure everything is. And it's a balance between how short are we going to make the attack window and what other overheads are we going to apply, right? And as the environment changes in terms of automation options and people's ability to do this in another way, that balance changes, and a shorter attack window becomes the more optimal decision, if that makes sense. So that's a big one. Outdated. So one of the big things that we've seen in the last 15 years in the world of the web PKI is we've watched that cryptographic agility is terrible. And the real case study for this was the deprecation of SHA-1, because the community came around to feeling that SHA-1 was no longer secure. And you'll remember this, Nick. You lived this, right? And so the decision was made, and we said, okay, we've got to deprecate SHA-1, and a date was set, and that date came. And at that point, we still allowed 3-year certificates. And so literally, if you had issued a cert the day before the deprecation date for SHA-1, you could have gotten a SHA-1 cert. And 36 months later, that cert might be operating on a website, and it was 100% compliant with all the rules at the time. And that was a wake-up call, I think, for a lot of people in the industry, including people in the browsers, to say, hey, this is just too long. We do not have the cryptographic agility that we require for a global, always-on web PKI where there will be absolute disaster if things are compromised. Like, this is not the level of agility that we need to keep our society safe and running. And that's what started kind of this focus on cryptographic agility. And I still think it's the best example of that. And then that's kind of gets into these other things, right? We like shorter TLS certificate life cycles because they do fit in well with an automated world and environment. We do like them for the agility, as we said, it's very important. And this is more than just cryptographic algorithms, although that's a big one, and especially with the post-quantum algorithms coming. And just generally, it allows us to create environments that operate cleanly, that are much less likely to have human error, that are much less likely to have unintended outages. Do you want to add to that, Nick?
No, I think you're right with everything you put there, Tim. I think the two kind of things I take away from this is regards to the first couple of bullet points, really, is that the shorter something is bad and out there, the better, right? So if we all know this in security, IT security in general, if you have a piece of malware or something out there or a virus, the quicker you can find and remove that, the better. You don't find it and then go, oh, I'll leave it and not bother to do anything about it for 12 months. You do something about it quickly as soon as you find it. And I think the same principle applies here, is the shorter something can be bad, and as you said, whether that's misissuance, whether that's a compromise, or whether that's some other kind of vulnerability, the shorter we can have that out there, the better. Now, we'll talk a minute on the next slide a little bit about the timelines that we've talked and how we get from, the 398 days today down to 47 and why. But I think one of the questions people have asked here in terms of that is, why don't we just go all the way down to 1-day certificates or hourly certificates, minute certificates, ephemeral certificates? And yeah, there is potentially, some certain use case for that.
Maybe one day.
And I'm sure that might be something we'll get to. I think the reality is what we're talking about here is the web PKI, as you refer to it, public certificates. And I'll talk a little bit more later on about how that kind of matters. But I think what people need to understand is this is in the greater context of the web, right? This is in the greater context of the billions of users that include you and I and everybody listening to this webinar as people who have laptops and desktops and phones and browsers and tablets and all of those good things. And the reason people like Apple and Google and Mozilla and Microsoft are big on this and all voted yes, and have certainly most of them have pushed this proposal for some time, is because they know how a certificate that's been misissued or compromised can impact the billions of users that they represent. So
Right.
one of the things I've heard is, oh, well, I don't care how long my certificate's out there for. I don't care if it's compromised. And the key thing to understand is it's not really you. It's not really you as an enterprise. It's not really you as a subscriber of a certificate. It's how that impacts the billions of users, or as we call them, relying parties who rely on this certificate. So the shorter we can have it out there in case something goes wrong, the better. Obviously, that leads to these other benefits that we have. Everybody knows nowadays automation is big. I think very few organizations have no automation, whether that's for deploying machines and software to your employees, whether that's building the servers that run your business. Automation is good, automation is better. And if you have something that is just a rote task that needs to be repeated, get it automated, have it logged, have it monitored, and don't worry about it anymore. And that's where we want to get to. And I think the last couple of points about flexibility and agility, we've talked about certificate and crypto agility many times, Tim. Moving to new algorithms, as you pointed out, moving to new standards. We're going to touch on postquantum at the end, which is the big kind of looming change. But overall, it is just the best practice to have. And I think we could go on for hours and hours probably on the reasons why this happens. But I think it's good to take away that the shorter something bad is out there, the better. And this is ultimately more efficient and more organized and safer for everybody, the billions of relying parties, if we get down to this nice 47-day or less in the future and everything becomes automated.
All right, great. Next slide, please. So this is what the actual step down looks like. So today, the maximum, and let's be clear, there are three things that are affected by this ballot. We talk a lot about maximum term, and that's maximum term for public TLS certificates, for server certificates specifically, not anything else. It's not changing the maximum term of SMIME or code signing or doc signing. It's changing server certificates, SSL
Yep.
certificates.
And it's public only. I know hopefully most people listening to this are aware, but we just want to stress your internal CAs, your private CAs that you may have, they are not impacted by this.
Unaffected.
Now,
Correct.
some platforms do have limitations on private certs. Let's just be clear. So if you're on a Windows platform, for example, you can issue a private TLS cert, so a private version of what we're talking about. You can have one for 10, 15, 20 years. It doesn't matter. Apple platforms do have a limitation on private server certificates of 825 days, but they are not planning to bring down this lifetime set chart, this short lifetime for private CAs. So it's public certificates, and as you said, Tim, it's TLS only, server certificates, or as we still call them in many places, SSL certificates. That's what we're talking about, not SMIME, not code signing, not doc signing, not any of that stuff. This is SSL only, and this is public SSL only. So the certs you would get to make sure that your site or service or infrastructure is trusted automatically by those billions of people worldwide. So we know exactly what the scope is here. And like you said, Tim, three things we need to talk about.
That is the first column, is the maximum term of those certificates. The second column is DCV, stands for Domain Control Validation. That is the thing you do to show the CA that you're in control of the domain for which you're getting the cert. And there's a number of different methods you can use. And there's what we call a DCV reuse period. And the basic idea here makes perfect sense, which is if you come and you order a cert, and then you go back into your console 10 minutes later and you order a second cert, do you really need to do DCV again if it's for the same domain? And so what's happened is a DCV reuse period has been specified. And during that period of time, if the same entity is ordering a cert for the same domain name, we do not require an additional domain control validation. That reuse period is also going to step down over time. And then the third one is what we call the OV reuse period. And OV stands for organization validation. So this is where we go in and we check it out and we confirm that this is actually Bank of Tallahassee, right? And that you are really that organization. And that is what we call organization validation, or OV. And there's a reuse period for that for the exact same reason. Do we really need to go back and revalidate Joe's Pizza tomorrow? And so all three of these will have their own step down schedule, and I will walk down each of these columns individually. We're going to spend the most time on certificate term. So today, the maximum certificate term is 398 days. And what that is 1 year, a leap year in particular, longest possible year, plus the longest possible month, 31 days, plus one more day. And so this is supposed to encapsulate the longest possible interpretation of the concept of 13 months, with the idea being that this will be on a 1 year cadence and you'll have an extra month for, weekends and holidays, and someone has to schedule a vacation and maybe it's not going to fall right on the right day. And you'll see that built into all of this. There's what I call plus a little bit. And the plus a little bit is supposed to give you a little bit of wiggle room around the cadence so that you can do a renewal early without breaking your cadence, or so you can do it on Monday instead of Saturday because that's where it happened to fall, right? That's the basic idea behind the plus a little bit. So right now, 398 days is 1 year plus a little bit. DCV reuse period matches the certificate term. I don't see any reason why that has to be, but that is what has been historically and what is in place right now. And then the OV reuse period right now is 825 days, which represents 2 years plus a little bit. And again, the same kind of idea, so that you can renew a little early or whatever, and it's all fine. So that's what that is. And as you see, all three of these things are going to step down, but they're going to step down differently. So starting in March 15, 2026, the certificate term and the DCV reuse period will step down to 200 days, and the OV reuse period will step down to 366 days. That represents, obviously, the longest possible interpretation of a year, right? That's a year and a leap year. So in other words, every year your organization will have to be revalidated. For what it's worth, that was how it was back in the 90s when SSL certificates were first originally made. Is your org had to be revalidated every year. So we've all gotten all the way back to that. And then at that point, that stops. Like the feeling from Apple is that checking your organization once a year is frequent enough, considering that organizational identities do change, but they don't change all that fast, right? There's some M&A activity and things change ownership and companies legally change their names, but that's rare and slow. And so truing up once a year, Apple feels is perfectly fine, and nobody is going to have to do anything more often than that. Were you going to say something about this, Nick?
I was just going to say two things. Number one is we say OV reuse period on here, of course, just so everyone's clear, that does also count for EV certificates as well. It's basically the same thing. It's the business validation. So if you get OV or EV certificates today, then that reuse period is going to go down in this chart to 1 year, 366 days, but it's not going to go further. So that, and I think that's, as well as what you just said, Tim, the business information changes less frequently. It's also something that can, many cases, be a bit more of a manual process to do that properly. It can't be as easily automated as, say, the domain validation reuse that we've talked about. One other thing, just to mention briefly, that to kind of clarify why these reuse periods are different. When you're validating a business or an entity name, as you said, that doesn't tend to change very often. The domain validation bit that we're changing, it's not just a domain. We call it domain because that's a shorthand. We're not talking about the kind of domains that you can go and buy from GoDaddy for 12 months and you buy them in 1 year periods. Certificates validate or verify a DNS entry, a fully qualified domain name. So like mailserver.nickfrance.com. And those are DNS entries which can change incredibly fast. Yeah, they can change instantaneously. They can be changed dynamically. And so
Yeah.
the reason we want to do the domain validation checks more frequently is because we're checking something that can change infinitely more frequently than, say, whether a business in existence or not. And I just think it's important to remember that's why there's a difference in those two actions, because one is
Sure.
changing something or checking something that changes infrequently, and one is checking something that can be, essentially dynamic and change all the time.
Okay, that's great. I like that, Nick. And maybe we can put a punctuation mark on this one while we're at it. The reason to step down the DCV, like you said, it's dynamic. And at the end of the day, this is the single most important thing that a certificate does, right? A server certificate, an SSL certificate. What it does is it ensures that you are really connected to the domain name that you expect to be connected to. And that is an irreplaceable role. There is nothing else in production today that you can use to do the same thing. And having that be out of sync is just undermining the fundamental point of why we do this. And if you think about
Yeah.
it now, with a 398-day DCV reuse period and the 398 certificate term, so do a little thought experiment with me. Let's suppose that I buy a certificate and I get DCV'd. And then let's suppose that the next day I sell that domain name. Well, not only do I have a valid certificate for up to 398 days, but on day 397, I could go order a new certificate from the same CA, not undergo DCV, get another 398-day certificate, and if you stretch out to the end of that certificate's lifespan, it can be 26 months after I lost control of the domain, and I still have a valid, not misissued certificate from a major public CA. And when you think about it that way, and I think that's exactly how people like folks at the browsers think about it, you just say, no, that's just too long. That's just too long. And so these changes shrink that, right?
Yep.
The certificate term is shrinking it, but also the DCV reuse is shrinking it as well.
You have to think what a certificate is. A digital certificate in this context, in the context of the web PKI, is essentially an attestation made by us as a CA that somebody controls both a private key, an encryption key, and a fully qualified domain name at the same time. And they have to prove that to us. They have to prove they control the key, and they have to prove they control this DNS entry. And if we do that, like your example, Tim, if we do that now, and then it's sort of valid for a year, and then you can issue another year certificate at the end of it, to say that someone controls a particular DNS entry for 2 whole years is not a particularly good attestation in today's modern world.
Right. Correct.
And in many cases, there are places, where and markets and certainly customers of ours where they do a domain verification every time they issue a certificate, and they're issuing potentially millions of short-term certificates all the time. So it's eminently possible. It's definitely more secure, and we can see this in the separate step down of that DCV reuse period over the slower changing org validation period.
Okay, so let's talk about the step down. Again, OV is covered. Let's set OV aside and not think about it for the rest of the presentation. From an EV perspective, today the maximum term for both of these things is 398 days. March 15, 2026, it goes down to 200 days. 200 days, what is that exactly? Well, what that is that 6 months plus a little bit. Remember I said we were going to be talking about plus a little bit. And the idea behind that is it's a nice round number we could all remember. Could have been 203, but that would have been hard to remember. So 200, easy number to remember. Half a year is 182 to 183 days. So what you do is your 200 days gives you a little bit of slush. You can renew a little early, or you can wait until after the weekend, or whatever. And so what you can do is you can get yourself on a cadence where every 6 months you are renewing these certificates. And that's the vision, is that we'll always know that this certificate is going June and that certificate is going in April. And then it'll happen on a regular cadence on those 6 month time frame. Then exactly 1 year later, March 15, 2027, we go down to 100 days. What's 100 days? Number one, it's a nice round number that's easy for all of us to remember. Number two, it's 3 months plus a little bit. So the same rationale applies here, right? That we can now get on a quarterly cadence or every 3 months. So this one will be done in, March, June, September, right? December, right? And then you run that every 90 days or every 3 months, and you get on a cadence with that. And that's the idea there. And then we've given you a little bit of extra so you can renew them earlier, deal if there's a technical error, you come in a couple days later and get your cert the old fashioned way and you didn't have an outage in the meantime. Stuff along those lines. That's why they're down to 100 days. And then the DCV matches the duration of the certificate volume every step of the way. So every step of the way, your DCV reuse period is contracting and your maximum certificate term is contracting. Then 2 years pass from March 15, 2027 to March 15, 2029. That is to give everybody ample time to get ready for the final step down step in this plan. So the final step down step is 47 days. What is 47 days? 47 days is 1 month plus a little bit. And there's a rationale behind why it's 47, not 45, and it has to do with the same kind of thing. You take 2 weeks and you imagine weekends falling in the exact worst place. It turns out 45 might possibly not quite give you the full 2 weeks when you count for weekends. So you add a couple days, get to 47, and now you're clean, right? So 47 days is the maximum term. But again, the vision is that we'll be on a monthly cadence. So it'll be, let's say, I'm making this up, second Tuesday of every month. And when that rolls around, the new cert gets deployed. And that 47 days gives you that monthly cadence plus a little room to deal with stuff. Now that's where the two periods break, right? March 15, 2029, DCV reuse period goes down to 10 days. 10 days being a nice short time. And now when you add those two together, 47 plus 10 days, the maximum amount of time that you can be out of sync on domain ownership is 57 days. Heck of a lot better than 2 years and 2 months. And
Absolutely.
that's the end goal for this step down program.
Yep.
Nick, you want to add to that?
I was going to say it's the end goal for the step down for this program and this proposal. So I think a little bit more background here and some questions that certainly I've been asked is, firstly, this is a result of the SC081 ballot that Apple proposed and Sectigo endorsed, and it was the result of a discussion. And I think it's something we can admit is something of a compromise in that last step down is 2 years apart, as opposed to a step down in 2028. So I think we have to acknowledge that. And again, it's a result of feedback. It's a result of the wider CA community having this discussion and making some level of compromise. But I also
would
think the
say
other
an
thing
abundance of caution, Nick, like
yes.
The concerns were these kind of theoretical what if people aren't ready, and so and the idea was, okay, well, tell you what, we'll give them a whole additional year to try to account for that what if. Yeah,
we've got this compromise in so people can be prepared. I think the other thing I wanted to kind of, or two things I wanted to add is, number one, you've done a great explanation of the days. People ask me why this many days, why that many days. I also think we shouldn't get too fixated on it. I think one of the big things is we have a step down. Remember, the original kind of proposal, such as it was, that came from Google, was we pick a date and we drop down to 90 days because we already issue millions of 90-day certs. This is a better transition. This guides people into it. This means, you could start your automation. We want everybody to start automation now. I'm a realist. I'm sure a lot of people won't. Maybe next year, 200 days will. It's 11 months away. But certainly the year after that, at 100 days, that's not far off the 90 that was proposed. People are going to have to automate by that point, and then certainly by 47 days. So I think it's less important to fixate on the number of days and try and explain it than it is that we have this nice gradual step down that is going to encourage people, but it's also going to give people some time to do it and time to do it.
And I'm imagining that some of this might come in phases. For some enterprises, they're going to find that some parts are easy to automate and other parts less so. So I'm imagining March 15, 2026 rolls around, And a subset, hopefully a small subset of your certs, still must be managed manually.
Yeah, I
However,
think we've talked
because
about
it's
that
a
before,
small
haven't we?
subset, doing them twice as often is
Yeah,
still manageable.
yeah.
And then
I
you've got
think it's
another year
important
to get more of those online because
to
if you have a
admit
subset, yeah, go on.
that aiming for 100% automation for everybody is probably an impossibility. Again, I'm a
Yeah,
realist. I
yeah,
would love that to be the case. But we know that the more you automate, the more you can focus the time you have left on
mhm,
solutions for those remaining certs that you do manually. There is
right.
something I want to talk a little bit about that on a minute. But a couple of other points I did want to make is number one, was 47 days the end goal? That's a question that I get asked as well. Is that, is that where we want to stop? Is it going to stop? I honestly don't think we know yet. I mean, it's
Yeah,
been discussed in
yeah,
certain places. Um, Realistically, by the time everybody gets to 2029 and we're all doing this and we're all at 47-day cadence, the majority of things that can be automated should be automated. And at that point, a drop from 47 days down to 7 days, down to 3 days, down to 10 days will be a lot easier than it is today to go from
yeah.
398 to 47. So I think 47 days may not be the end goal. I think there's potentially some too short options. I think, as I said before, the exaggeration, why not do a new certificate every hour? Well, a good example is because we're talking
Yeah,
about the web and browsers and people's machines, there's a scary number of people's machines who have something called clock skew, where their laptop
yeah.
clock may be off by days or more. And then if you only have a 1 day certificate and your clock's off by 3 days, you might never get to that website. You may never be able to use that service. So we do have to think
Hmm.
of some lower bounds. But once we get to 47, it's not necessarily the end goal, but it's certainly somewhere once we get there, we can do, a lot more automation and we can make that last step much, much easier. So I think we'll see lower, but I think it'll be easy by that point, or relatively easy compared to today.
Yes,
I think the last point I
and
want to make on this, sorry,
mhm.
Tim, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, and it ain't gonna be lower than that before March 15, 2029, right? Like,
No, no,
and
no, no.
and not even it won't be lower than that anytime in the year 2029. Like we're gonna get to this by the time we get to 2029, which is 4 years from now, there will be better visibility possibly on the next steps in decreasing, but nobody's gonna spring a 10-day cert on you in April of 2029.
No,
Right?
I
This
agree.
is
Well, I don't.
this is
Well,
gonna be
I
what we
was going
have
to
for a bit.
caveat that. I would caveat
Yeah.
that by saying no one's going to force that change, but certainly it's possible. We have customers issuing really short lifetime certificates today. I
Yeah,
know our friends over at Let's
true.
Encrypt have very publicly announced they're going to do 6-day certificates. So if someone wants to do a 6-day certificate or a 3-day certificate, they could do that today. But I think you're right that no one's going to force these changes. No one's going to make any additional changes and say, right, we're not doing 47 days in 2029. We're doing 10-day certificates in 2029. I don't think that's likely to happen, but I think we will
I agree.
see more organizations and more enterprises choosing voluntarily to go to short lifetime certs because they can and because they understand the benefits as well. So I think we will see some of that. And we can monitor that. We can all see that. We've got certificate transparency logs and we all have data to be able to see who's adopting that and hopefully cheer those people on and support them as best we can. But the one final point I wanted to make on this, Tim, about these difference in timelines, it's that DCV reuse period, and I think that was the lead that was buried in a lot of this, and I think that's the bit that people need to focus on a little bit more. We've talked for many years now, or 2 years plus, about the short lifetime certificates and the need for automation. That's not changed. That's absolutely required. But this idea of re-verifying your domain names, there are some places, as I've said, certainly we have them where we do require subscribers to validate their domains every time they get a new certificate. So there's no new challenge there. But we also know there's lots of enterprises from pretty much every CA who is doing that domain validation once a year, and it's maybe a big annual job, and they get someone in to do it. It takes a few days, and they're clicking links in emails and waiting for messages to get through. Doing that every 7 days, or 10-day cadence, I'm saying 7 days, is going to be a big challenge. It's going to require your organization to work closely with your domains and DNS team. It's going to require you to look at parts that you can very easily be automated, and there are many solutions out there, but they perhaps haven't been looked at until today or until now. So I think it's just important for everybody to remember this isn't just about automating
Yeah,
short lifetime certificates, it's about automating the domain validation as well, because that component is just as critical, if not more critical, than the lifetime
sure.
of the certificates coming down itself. And I don't want people to miss that. Hopefully they won't, but I
Yeah,
want to make sure it's not something that's been missed.
agreed. All right, next slide. On April 13th, 2025, this ballot passed. By the rules of the CA Browser Forum, there is a mandatory 1 month intellectual property review. We are in the midst of that. That is a requirement. What that is if a ballot represents something that somebody feels they own a patent on or they own that IP, that gives them 30 days to say, hey, I own this IP. This is a problem. Now, that's a nonsensical concept in terms of reducing a certificate lifespan. However, it is still part of the mandated process. So this ballot doesn't become official before May 13, 2025. I can't imagine a way there would be a credible IPR claim, and I'm quite confident that as of May 15, this will be official CAB forum rules. And then the first effective date, as we mentioned, is March 15, 2026.
So we don't have long before the first date
Yep.
starts.
Right. So I think the rest of the slide, we kind of pound on the idea of this is the time to think about automation. So let's go to the next slide and we'll start pounding on that idea. Yeah, okay. Outages are bad. Let's keep going. Right. So automate. So this is our approach, right? We're in the step one right now, awareness and discovery. Some of us may have moved beyond step one, which is most of us are probably in step one. That's why you're here, right? 47 day. Oh, this is coming. This is for real. What do I need to do? So it's important to understand where you're deploying these certificates and what your automation options are. Now, one of the things that I've seen just anecdotally looking at people discussing this proposal on bulletin boards and whatnot is there are a lot of people who do not understand the certificate automation options that are available to them. And I see lots and lots of voices online saying, no, you can't do that on my platform. And it actually turns out you can. They just don't know it. So one of the things that I want to encourage everybody to do now is this is the time to go back, say, where are my certificates deployed? And what are my true automation options, which isn't the same as what did we do or what were the options 5 years ago when we started doing this, or what does the gray hair who's been here for the last 25 years think are the options, right? It's what are the actual options like factually, and figure that out and get then you from there you build a plan, right? You build a plan to say, what am I going to automate, where, and you want to think about things I mentioned before, like the ease of automation. If there's stuff that's simple and trivial, just do it. Get it out of the way. If they're high stakes functions where an outage would be extra bad, that's probably a good thing to focus on first. And so, figure out your automation plan and put things in place and start deploying. And the last thing I will also just mention on this is you don't need to wait until March 14, 2026 to put these things in place. You can be putting them in place now. And if you put them in place now, you have a chance to shake out the bugs and make sure everything's working as expected, and you start getting the benefits. You get the benefits of automation early. And so, we would recommend not only do you want to probably try to do this before March 15th, but if you're going to do it anyway, you should probably just do it. Nick, you want to add to that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it is kind of a frustration of mine, having been around in this industry for far too long, that automation has been widely possible for almost the entire time I've been involved. That's 2 decades plus, and I'm sure the same for you, Tim. So it's something that people should start to look at today. Thankfully, many people are, as we'll talk about in a minute. There's a lot of new great technologies, and this list of steps is a great kind of high level overview, almost like board level guide as to what we need to do. We need to be aware there's a change. We need to find out what we have. We need to take inventory and do the rest of the mapping and then start a rollout. I think a couple of points I would add to this, though, is The bit about vendors, one of the complaints I've sort of heard from a number of places, just like you said, Tim, is, oh, my XXX appliance doesn't support this, or my ABC software doesn't support automation. And there are many cases where that is true, and certainly there's workarounds and there are absolutely tools available. But I think now is also the time, given this ballot has now officially passed, and it's not just you and I speculated on a webinar again, Tim, is that vendors will actually start to build this stuff out. The people who make the appliances, the firewalls, the servers, the softwares, the solutions will start to take more seriously your customer comments, our CA comments, but also look at the industry and realize, hey, I need to build an Acme client into this appliance. I need to stick some options for certificate automation in my platform, and modern certificate automation. I need to be able to support, SHA-384, and I need to support 4K RSA key sizes and all the ECC curves and all the rest of it. So I think it's a good opportunity, and I think we hopefully, now it's official, we'll start to see vendors adopting it a lot more and starting to build it first party into their solutions. I think the one other thing I do want to add here, and it was a point I was going to touch on earlier, is that there's always going to be places where, as you've said, Tim, you can't automate certificates, and I can't do this. And maybe it isn't even something that a vendor can solve. Maybe we're talking about telcos and financials and maybe healthcare and places where there are systems that are old, but they work. And what I would say to those, and what I've said to many, kind of customers and partners and everybody else that I've talked to in recent months, is it might be also a time to evaluate whether a publicly trusted server certificate is actually the right choice for this thing. Okay, because if I want to publish my father's website where he talks about dogs or talks about going to different cafes and doing reviews, I need a public certificate. I need a public server certificate. I need to be able to publish that site somewhere and have any one of the, I won't say billions, let's call it dozens of people who might like to read it, be able to access that site without any problems. If I have some kind of internal device management system, or I'm in a hospital and I have medical equipment attached to real human beings that for some reason needs to communicate to a computer server in that hospital, there is no reason that certificate should be one from a public CA. There isn't any reason. That should be a private CA infrastructure, or that should be some alternative kind of technology. And I think what I've seen is, because our technology is so widely deployed, so battle tested, and just been used by everyone for 25, 30 years plus, there's many places where they just use a certificate, and probably just use a certificate and maybe have the word VeriSign in there somewhere, for example. And those are the things where we need to do some evaluation as to whether a public certificate is the right technology. So if you do think that there is a real problem being able to automate, or you do have a kind of infrastructure where you control both the server and the client, so you control the devices and you control the server, they are great use cases, and now is the time to start exploring alternatives like private CAs instead of worrying about having to do this automation. So that's another thing that I think I would add to this, is just evaluate whether the right technology is being used, and if this change kind of pushes you to make that evaluation, I think you'll be in a much better place.
And Nick, not to pile on with that, but I guess I'm going to, which is, you talked about this scenario of these systems that we don't feel are upgradable, right? For whatever reason. It's unsupported software, or it's homegrown and nobody's done a build any time in the last 15 years and we don't have the source code. And we know all this stuff exists. We all know it. The trouble with that is that you may say, okay, I'm going to move to private CA, and that way I don't have to deal with automation, et cetera, et cetera. That's all fine. However, you are going to have to deal with post-quantum cryptography. And if these systems are unupgradable, if that's a word, are not upgradable, then that means you will not be able to make them post-quantum cryptography compliant, which means you will be absorbing the risk of these systems, which oftentimes are the most essential because they're foundational, because they're early. And these foundational early systems will be basically cracked wide open starting 2030 or beyond. And so we also need to ask ourselves, if we really are running something foundational on a 22-year-old backbone that we can't upgrade, do we maybe need to face the reality that we are begging for a disaster? And put something in place that does allow these systems to be crypto agile. And I will just throw that out there. That's not the topic of
No,
this webinar, but since you brought it up, I think that's something that everybody on this call needs to be thinking about.
I think you're right, Tim, and I think it is a good point to make, because we don't want to just sit here and say, everybody's got to automate all the time 100%, because I think that's naive. And I think you make a good point that there are going to be some old systems that need to be looked at in terms of whether it's the right technology or whether they can even continue to exist. And we did see a bit of that in the SHA-1, SHA-2 change. I remember we had a
Yeah.
number of subscribers who wanted to get SHA-1 certificates because of their old devices. But the reality is those devices don't work on the modern internet today. Right, you can't
Yeah.
have those. I want a certificate that I can support my Windows mobile devices talking to the server. Well, they can't actually do that today. Old versions of Windows XP can't connect. Old versions of operating systems. So a lot of those things kind of naturally become obsolete anyway as security moves on. It's not always nice. Nobody likes waste. Nobody likes deprecating old systems that have worked for many years. But I think we have to face the reality, especially as a security vendor, as we are, Tim, that there are times when things simply can't be secure enough to operate, at least on the public internet. And again, in your example, if there's an old backbone or an old system there, then if it can't handle all this stuff and you do have a risk of post-quantum, then you either need to think about retiring it or isolating it very, very, very well from any other
Yeah.
risks like decryption and data theft and all the rest of it. So it's good food for thought, and it's a little bit beyond the idea of 47 days itself, but I think it's
Sure.
very, very relevant and very well connected.
While we're here, while we're talking about it. All right, next slide, please. We talked about all of this. We talked about all of this. We can
Yeah,
move on.
this is really just about talking about certificate management. It's the same thing as automation, right? But this slide is a lot better than the last one. And this is just trying to drive home the fact that there are a lot of different automation standards. I know we say Sectigo supports it, we do, but I'm sure all the other CAs out there, Tim and I are not here to try and do a sales pitch on this one. This is not what we do. We're here to educate. And I think it is important to know that, again, there are a lot of automation standards out there. There's a couple of gold standards, or there's really the one gold standard, which is Acme.
Yeah.
There's a few other options there as well, depending on the kind of infrastructure that you have. But this is really just saying that automation is eminently possible. You and I have talked about Acme a lot, Tim, in a lot of our presentations. We think it's a fantastic standard. We support it. Almost all public CAs, well, they kind of have to support it today, thanks to some of the Chrome root program policies. But it is the best, and it's designed for exactly what it needs to do. Okay, it does a certificate automation for server certificates. It does the domain validation, and it does the installation. And that's exactly what it does and what it will continue to do. So I think everybody needs to look at that and realize that we do have great automation standards that are battle tested, open source, thousands of clients available the world over, and they should absolutely be used. And there are other options as well if people can't use Acme for whatever reason. There's agents, there's APIs, and there's older protocols like SCEP and EST available as well. So there's a lot of automation options for everybody to choose from.
All right, next, please. And then we already referenced. So quantum computers are going to break RSA and ECC. I don't think that there's a lot of serious thinkers that are contesting that idea at this stage. It's also become clear and obvious that quantum computers are no longer an if, they're a when. This is not a science project. This is now an engineering task. And there are many organizations around the globe, well-resourced organizations that are racing to the best quantum supremacy as fast as they possibly can, not just private companies like IBM and Google and Microsoft, but also states, countries, right? And the states worry me more because some of these states, we know what they're going to do with their quantum computer, and it's going to involve looking at your secrets. And so we do all need to migrate to PQC. We're not ready to do it yet. The standards are getting closer to being done, but they're still not actually done. We couldn't give you a PQC certificate today. It would be non-compliant. We'd have to revoke it as soon as we did, a public cert. But we do have something, and it's not in this slide deck, but we do have something we call the Sectigo Quantum Labs. And in there we have what we call our PQC sandbox. you can contact us and sign up for the PQC Sandbox if you're an existing customer. And basically what it is you have the ability to issue private root certs using the main signature algorithm, MLDSA. And you can issue private root certs on MLDSA for use in your own production environments. You won't be able to use, I'm sorry, in your own test environments. You won't be able to use them in a production environment because they're private use. But if you want to do things like start installing them on your systems, clone your systems, install them in a dev environment and see what breaks, it's a great thing you can do starting today. So PQC is coming. PQC is going to need to be dealt with. And when you do that, you're going to be swapping everything out anyway. And part of that is going to be automation. So these things kind of flock together in terms of the needs they have and how to work with them. So just remember that's coming too.
This is the big
And
boogeyman for making all these changes, isn't it, really? But if we can get to a point where everybody's automated enough that if a practically deployable quantum computer comes along and we need to race to change all of our algorithms that we use for TLS and that we use for certificates, the fact that we could potentially do it in a hypothetical best case scenario of 47 days plus a few means we're in a much better position than we would have been today or even a few years ago, where we'd have to wait for a 10-year cert to expire and that thing to be vulnerable for as long as we could sit around and wait to deploy a new technology. So the automation is really going to help us get to a stage where we don't have to worry as much collectively as users, as enterprises, and as an industry about the post-quantum kind of apocalypse that's on the horizon at some point soon. So it's a really good excuse to do it. And if people want to hear about it and want to know why, use some kind of scapegoat for it, then it's a great excuse for that automation push as well.
Awesome. Next slide, please. If you liked this conversation, I co-host a podcast called Root Causes, a PKI and security podcast. We put up new episodes every week, and we talk about matters like this, matters of PKI and web PKI and public certs and private certs and CA browser form and encryption and all kinds of stuff like that. So join us, please, and we'll get going on that right away. And with that, Leah, I think we're ready for questions.
We are. First question is, will browsers only support certificates of 47 days or less?
Well, what'll
ultimately.
happen is it'll be a CAB form requirement. So if we start issuing certificates that are longer than the days you see in the step down, then we'll be non-compliant. On March 16, 2026, if I issue a 201-day certificate, that will be non-compliant. And I will have to revoke it, and I will have to have a compliance incident. So this will be enforced on the CA side. Will the browsers put a hard check in place for public certs? I don't know. Maybe they will, maybe they won't, but it won't really matter because CAs won't be allowed to issue these, and if they do accidentally issue them, they will have to revoke them.
I think the one extension I'd say to that, Tim, when I've usually heard that question, and you're absolutely right in your answers, I think there probably will be programmatic checks in the future. But where I've seen that question come from is, well, can you just issue me a certificate anyway because I don't care about the browsers? And the answer is no, right? As Tim has explained, if we were to issue, or any CA were to issue a public certificate beyond the timelines in that chart, they would be effectively very quickly distrusted and all of their certificates would be gone and they would likely be out of business. So it's a hard requirement, whether the browsers implement it in code or whether they just leave it to the CAs and their auditors. It's not something that's movable. It's happening. It's going to happen. And if you need a public cert, you have to adhere to those timelines. End of story, really.
Okay, cool. Next.
Great. What is the 47-day TLS referring to if the DCV is 10 days and OV reuse is 366 days?
That's the actual maximum term for a certificate itself. So 47 days is the most possible time that the certificate can be valid. So if the certificate is issued on day 1, it will expire not later than day 47.
Great. Is there any impact on private CA signed certificates?
No, not at the moment. No, there's been no indication that this is going to change private certs. It's entirely for public certs. That's the scope. As I said earlier in the presentation, most browsers and operating systems will let you do private CAs and private certificates for as long as you want. There are some operating systems, like Apple with their Safari browser, for example, where they do have an enforced limit on private server certificates of around, I think, 825 days. That's the only one I'm aware of. I don't think many other systems are going to implement that. I also don't think for private CAs that this timeline is going to apply by anybody at all. There is going to be no need to have your private CAs issue 47-day certificates, unless you want to, of course, but there's going to be no requirement to do that. If any of the browsers or the operating systems decide to do that, they'll, of course, let people know. We'll know and we'll talk about it, but I don't think any of us expect that to happen, and this is just about public TLS server certificates.
Right. Will the new terms change for intermediate and root certificates?
Well, that's a good question as well. There
Yeah.
are going to be some changes in the terms of issuing CAs or intermediates and root CAs. They are going to be rotated more frequently, certainly not down to the basis of 398 days all the way down to 47, but we are going to see roots and issuing CAs cycle through much more frequently than they have in the past. That largely shouldn't be an issue. That's obviously something that we as CAs have to work on, and we have to work with the browser and the operating system vendors to make sure our certificates are widely distributed. That's easier nowadays when people update their software more frequently and software has updates. I will say, for anybody concerned about the change of routes and issuing CAs more frequently, if that's something that concerns you, it's unfortunately very likely that you're doing something that we would consider a bad practice. You are either pinning to a public certificate, which is a real no-no, or you are doing something where you are having a limited or kind of custom trust store in your software or in your device or whatever. So if you are not tracking the Microsoft, the Mozilla, the Apple, or the Google trust stores, and you're doing it yourself, I would strongly recommend you stop doing that and start tracking one. The pace of change in our industry, the frequency in which routes and issuing CAs are going to be updated in the future, basically means, again, assess whether you need a public cert for this. If you do, you need a trust store that needs to be updated every month, and you need to be able to basically handle intermediates changing on a whim, because that shouldn't really matter to any application or software.
And let's be clear, we're still talking about things that are 2 orders of magnitude longer than the times you saw here. So
yes,
the the browsers are getting to the point where all CA roots are going to be a maximum of 15 years in length. And in the long term, Google has stated they would like to get it down to 7. So we're not talking about anything approaching 200 days or 47 days. These are still years and years in length, and there's no plan on the horizon to make them less than that.
Right. We're coming up to the hour. If we haven't answered your question, we'll get back to you separately. But thank you everyone for your time, and thanks Nick and Tim. If you've got any more questions, then do get in touch with us. We also have another webinar coming up next week around the use cases of public and private PKI, and you can sign up on our website. We'd love to see you. But for now, thank you and have a good rest of your day.